Proposition 1 with Luke Kushmero from the Legislative Analyst Office.
Good evening. I'm Luke Kushmaro with the Legislative Analyst Office. Before I get into Proposition 1, I'll briefly introduce our office and then talk about the proposition. The Legislative Analyst Office has a constitutional responsibility to provide impartial analysis of statewide propositions that appear on the ballot. In this role, we aim to help voters understand what a proposition would do if passed and the potential fiscal impacts. One important note is that we do not weigh in on the merits of the propositions or the arguments made by the proponents or the opponents. However, we are happy to answer questions you might have about the propositions and their potential effects. Getting into Proposition 1, this is in regards to a constitutional amendment regarding reproductive freedom. I'll start off with a little bit of background, then talk about the proposition. At the federal level, in the past, the US Supreme Court has found that the US Constitution generally protected the right to abortion, and as a result, states had limited ability to place restrictions on abortions. However, in June 2022, the US Supreme Court decided that the US Constitution does not protect the right to abortion. As such, states now have more flexibility to decide whether or not to allow, limit, or ban abortions. When it comes to contraceptives, birth control, the US Supreme Court has found that the US Constitution protects the right to buy and use contraceptives. In addition, the federal law requires most health insurance plans to pay for contraceptives. At the state level, the California Constitution guarantees the right to privacy, and the California Supreme Court has found that this right includes the right to reproductive choices, such as whether or not to have an abortion or use contraceptives. In addition, state law was later passed to protect these specific rights in statute. State law has placed some restrictions on abortions. However, because of the way the California courts have interpreted the constitutional right to privacy, the state can only restrict abortions in certain circumstances, such as to protect public health and safety. Two situations where this occurs is that abortion providers must be licensed, and once a fetus is viable, abortions can only be performed if the pregnancy puts the pregnant person's life or health at risk. Now, getting to Proposition 1, this would change the California Constitution by adding language saying that the state cannot deny or interfere with a person's reproductive freedom, and that people have the fundamental right to choose whether or not to have an abortion and whether or not to use contraceptives. Because these rights already exist in California, the proposition would have no direct fiscal effect. However, whether a court might interpret the proposition to expand reproductive rights beyond existing law is unclear. In the event that a court does find that the proposition expands these rights, there could be fiscal effects to the state. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kim and then take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. So first of all, who put this on the ballot? The state legislature did. It was almost a party line vote. They did have, I think, one Republican vote or maybe two. They did so after the Dobbs ruling overturning Roe versus Wade. And next, we're going to go into endorsements, and then we'll do campaign funding, and we'll do that for each of the initiatives. So in support of this one, we have our governor, several members who are Democrats of the Assembly and the State Senate, and the Democratic Party of California. In opposition, we have the Republican Party and the association that, the State Assembly Republican Party of California as well. So this is a party differential. And as far as groups go, we have abortion rights groups, as you might imagine, that are in support of it. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, League of Women Voters, SEIU, Equality California. And in opposition, we have the California Conference of Catholic Bishops, California Alliance of Pregnancy Care, and some faith-based organizations. So I should say just at the beginning here that these lists of endorsements may not be comprehensive. There could be some that we've missed out on, but we've looked at several different places to find these endorsements. So they should be legit, but there could be some that are missing if you want to keep, looking at endorsements, if that helps you. And then as far as newspapers go, we have several newspapers around the state that have weighed in support of this measure, but none who have weighed in opposition. And then for expenditures, we have a Native American tribe that's given a lot of money in favor, the California Medical Association, Planned Parenthood, as you might expect, California Teachers Association, ACLU. And then in opposition, East Valley Republican Women and Patriots store, and then some very much smaller amounts from individuals. So you can see that there's a big, okay, another thing that I want to say is that these two figures don't always line up. They're from two different sources. This one is more up to date than this. These second slides that have the total are meant to just give you an overall idea about the amount of money being spent on this and how lopsided it is. So take it a little bit with a grain of salt because new numbers keep coming in. So the supporters have put a lot more money into it essentially than the opponents at this point. All right, what questions do you have? Please put those questions in the Q&A. And Andrea, Terry, if you could also put your camera back on, and Luke as well, and we will go ahead with whatever questions we have from the audience. If you have questions, I see some hands are raised. If you could type them into the Q&A, please.
I'm seeing one question right now, Kim, which is just, will the PowerPoint be available for downloading?
We will have the videos that have the PowerPoint in them. We could add the PowerPoint too, sure. It'll be on the the PI website. What questions do you have about Prop 1? Luke, could I get you back here?
So I have a question here from Diane that says, does a yes vote allow for late term abortions if the life of the mother and child is not threatened?
So the current statute would remain on the books, which includes the restriction on post-viability abortions, unless the health or well-being of the pregnant person is at risk. Whether or not a court might ultimately change that finding is unclear. That ultimately would be something that would be determined by the courts.
And the next question, if there's another state law about reproductive freedom being a right, how does this proposition add to those rights or guarantee these rights more?
Yes, so as I noted before, the California Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution to include the rights to abortion and contraceptives, as well as other reproductive rights. And then state law specifically requires this. This would change the Constitution to specifically require this. So it would no longer depend on the court's interpretation of the right to reproductive privacy to include these. Essentially, what that means is that the legislature would not be able to change reproductive rights, which they currently could do under statute, so long as they meet that definition. And then there could be some back and forth with the Constitution, but it would now be specifically defined in the Constitution rather than depending on the court interpretation and then statute.
Great. And then the next question is, would this change insurance companies' requirements to cover procedures and prescriptions for birth control?
So it shouldn't have a significant effect there, as far as I'm aware. Federal law already requires most health insurance plans to cover contraceptives. When it comes to abortions, it gets a little more complicated, but this shouldn't have any impact on that, especially if there is no court decision finding that this is a change to reproductive rights, assuming that this is just putting into plain language in the Constitution existing rights. There shouldn't be any sort of changes to that.
And then, is there a clear definition in this bill of reproductive freedom or reproductive rights?
So the bill does not specifically define reproductive freedom. It does call specifically out abortions and birth control, but it does not necessarily limit it to those two categories.
And then next question, there are lots of questions on this one. If Prop 1 is passed, can a federal national abortion ban or restriction that passes through Congress supersede it?
Ultimately, it would probably depend on how that is structured. Due to our federal system, federal law typically trumps state law. It gets a little more messy when it comes to constitutional issues. So that likely would ultimately go through some sort of court process. but typically that would be the case that federal would trump state.